I need to be clear about something before I tell you how this started. If you're listening to this because you like stories about strange jobs, or places people avoid, or things that don't make sense until it's already too late, then you should understand that this isn't really a story about a job. That's just how it begins. That's the part that makes it sound ordinary enough to listen to. What this is actually about is attention. I didn't realize that at first. I thought attention was something I was giving, watching, observing, sitting in a place and doing nothing, the way I was told. But that's not how it works. Not really. Not with the thing I encountered. Attention isn't one way. It never was. The moment you notice something, it notices you back. I know how that sounds. I would have rolled my eyes too once. I would have assumed I was building suspense or dramatizing something that could be explained away with stress or a lack of sleep. I would have said that people see patterns when they're alone too long, that silence does things to the brain, and I tried to tell myself all of that, repeatedly. But there are details I can't get rid of, details that don't fade, no matter how much time passes. Sounds that still feel close when I think about them. Moments where I remember understanding something all at once, and then losing that understanding the second I tried to put it into words. So I'm going to tell you what I can remember, in the order it happened, without exaggerating anything, without filling in gaps where my memory goes thin. Because if I start guessing, if I start assuming, I'll lose track of what was real. And that's not something I can afford to do anymore. Not after what listened. This happened during a period of my life when I was already worn down, tired in a way that doesn't go away with sleep. The kind of tired that comes from too many small disappointments stacked on top of each other until even simple decisions feel heavy. I was living in a town I hadn't planned on staying in, working jobs that never quite lined up with what I thought I'd be doing by that point in my life. I wasn't looking for mystery. I wasn't looking for danger. I was looking for something boring and reliable, something that paid cash and didn't ask questions. That's important to understand, because if I had been chasing thrills or horror or answers to questions no one else seemed to be asking, then what happened later might feel inevitable. Like I walked into it on purpose. But I didn't. I was trying to survive quietly. I was trying to get through my days without attracting attention. And somehow I did the opposite. There's a moment I keep coming back to. It didn't feel important at the time. It barely registered. But looking back, it's the point where everything started leaning in a direction I didn't notice until it was too late. It was the moment I stopped reading the job listing as a warning and started reading it as an invitation. I want you to understand this clearly. No one forced me to take that job. No one threatened me. No one lied to me outright. I wasn't coerced or blackmailed or tricked in any obvious way. The choice was mine, completely. That's the part that bothers me the most. Because whatever was waiting out there didn't need to drag anyone in. It didn't need to chase or hunt or lure people with false promises. It just needed someone desperate enough to sit still and listen. Someone willing to be present when nothing seemed to be happening. Someone like me. If I sound calm right now, it's not because this doesn't scare me anymore. It's because panic stopped being useful a long time ago. Fear burns hot and fast. What stays longer is something colder, something heavier, a sense that certain doors don't really close once you've stood in front of them long enough. I don't know if telling this will make any difference. I don't know if it's a warning or a confession, or just a record of events that were always going to happen whether I spoke about them or not. But if you take anything from this, let it be this. Some places don't want to be explored. They don't want to be understood. They just want to be acknowledged. And once you do, They remember you. The diner was the kind of place you stopped noticing after a while. Not because it was bad, just because it never changed. Same cracked vinyl booths, same burnt coffee smell that clung to your clothes longer than it should have. Same radio behind the counter, always tuned just low enough that you could hear the voices, but never quite make out what they were saying. I went there most mornings because it was cheap, close, and predictable. Predictability mattered to me then. It still does, I guess. Or it did, before I learned how fragile it actually is. The job listing was pinned to the corkboard near the restrooms, half hidden behind flyers for lost dogs and yard sales that had already happened. I must have walked past it a dozen times without really seeing it. It blended in too well. Plain white paper, black marker, no branding, no tear-off tabs. Just a block of text written neatly enough that it felt deliberate. Night watcher needed. Private property. Cash paid weekly. No experience required. There was a phone number underneath. No name. No address. Just a number, written twice, like whoever put it up wanted to be sure it stayed legible. At first, I barely registered it. My eyes skimmed past the words the same way they skimmed past everything else on that board. But something about it kept pulling my attention back. Not urgency, not excitement, just a sense that it didn't belong there in the same way the other flyers did. The other postings were loud in their own way. Bright colors, big fonts, exclamation points. This one didn't compete for attention. It waited, and when it waited, it felt patient, calculating, almost, though I didn't know it at the time. I remember standing there longer than I meant to, coffee cooling in my hand, rereading the same 4 lines over and over. Night watcher. I tried to imagine what that meant. Security guard, maybe. Someone paid to sit in a booth or a shack and make sure nothing obvious went wrong. It sounded dull. Safe. The kind of work where nothing happening meant you were doing your job right. But I couldn't shake a small, nagging thought. What if nothing was never just nothing? The words cash paid weekly stuck with me more than they should have. I told myself that was normal. Anyone short on money would notice that. Anyone tired of waiting for checks to clear or managers to get back to you would appreciate something straightforward. Still, I didn't call it right away. I asked the waitress about it when she came by to refill my cup. She glanced over her shoulder at the board, squinted, and shrugged. That thing's been up forever, she said. No idea who it's for. Ever see anyone take it down? I asked. She shook her head. Nope. Comes down, goes back up. Or maybe it never comes down. Hard to say. That should have unsettled me more than it did. At the time, I laughed it off. Bulletin boards are messy. People forget things. Maybe whoever posted it just refreshed it every once in a while. But when I started paying attention, I noticed something else. No one ever stood near it. People passed the board constantly, on their way to the restroom, on their way out the door. But they didn't linger the way I had. Their eyes slid past that corner without stopping. It wasn't avoidance exactly, more like omission, like their minds edited it out before it could form a complete thought. I started asking around after that, casually, quietly. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Most people gave the same vague answers. They'd seen the flyer. Maybe. They weren't sure. Didn't know who it belonged to. Didn't know anyone who'd called. A few said it was probably some rich landowner looking for cheap labor. A couple joked that it was probably haunted. They laughed when they said that. But one man didn't. He was older, sat alone by the window most mornings, always paid an exact change. When I asked him about the listing, His hand froze halfway to his mug. He didn't look at me. He looked at the board. "That job doesn't like being talked about," he said. I waited for him to smile, to clarify, to let me know he was joking. He never did. Even now, I remember the way his eyes didn't leave the board. They lingered longer than a human gaze should, longer than comfort allowed. Something behind them seemed old, waiting, and I realized, much later, that the pause in his glance wasn't warning me. It was acknowledging something already in motion, something I hadn't seen yet. I told myself it was local superstition. Small towns collect stories the way dust collects in corners. The more ordinary a place is, the more room there is for rumors to grow in the empty spaces. Even so, I found myself thinking about the listing more than I meant to, about the simplicity of it, about how little it asked for. No experience, no qualifications, just presence, just time. I went back to the board one last time before leaving that morning. I read the number carefully, committing it to memory even though my phone was right there in my pocket. I remember hesitating. There was a faint indentation in the paper, like it had been pressed hard against the corkboard repeatedly. The corners were worn, the pinholes stretched. That piece of paper had been handled more than it should have been for something no one claimed to want. And for the first time, I noticed the shadows beneath the pinholes, long, thin, moving just a fraction when I blinked. I told myself it was nothing. Light, maybe. My imagination. Yet the feeling that I was being watched crept along my spine. Subtle, patient, waiting for me to look away. I could walk away. Forget about it. Get another job somewhere else. There were options. Not great ones, but enough. Instead, I took out my phone. I dialed the number before I could think too hard about why my hand was shaking. The phone rang in my hand like it was too heavy. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment longer than I needed, as if hesitation could undo the choice I had already made. But I had made it. The number was there, staring at me, as plain and deliberate as the flyer itself. I pressed call. The line clicked once, twice. Static at first, faint, like something far away was breathing through it. And then a voice answered. Not a greeting, not a hello. Just a statement. "You're here," it said. I froze. My first instinct was to laugh nervously. Probably a prank. A local kid trying to scare someone desperate enough to call. But even as I moved my mouth, my voice didn't come out. My hand shook, and the coffee in my other hand sloshed over the edge of the cup. "You're here," it repeated, slower this time. Warmer, familiar, like it already knew who I was, even better than I did. Yes. I managed. There was a long pause, one that stretched just past reason. I could hear a faint hum in the background, like the faint ringing of a bell you only hear at the edge of perception. Then the voice spoke again, calm, neutral, almost courteous. "Good. You understand what you're signing up for." I tried to laugh, nervously, to shake the feeling that something cold and heavy had touched the base of my spine. I think so. You'll find out soon enough," it said. And then, without another word, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, unwilling to move, unwilling to drop it. My heart was beating too fast for my ears to hear anything else, and yet the silence in the diner felt heavier than the phone call itself. I couldn't shake the idea that the space around me had changed somehow, that the air in the room had thickened, as if it were holding its breath. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was overreacting, that I had called a number on a piece of paper in a small town, and the person on the other end had freaked me out. Nothing more. But there were subtle things I couldn't ignore. A shadow in the corner of the diner that didn't match anything. A chill that ran across my shoulder, though the heater was on. Even the other patrons seemed to look at me differently, their eyes sliding past me in ways that made my skin crawl. I left the diner in a hurry, telling myself I was going to take the job seriously, just to see what it really was. Cash paid weekly, no experience required. A night watch position. Safe, dull, harmless. And yet, as I walked toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took had already been anticipated. That somewhere, some unseen presence had known I would call, had known I would come. I glanced back once, toward the board, toward the diner, toward the town, and it all seemed still, like the town itself was holding its breath. I didn't stop to think about why. I didn't want to. I just kept driving, feeling the eyes on me, even though I was alone on the road. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time my eyelids drifted, I thought I could hear a voice whispering my name, distant at first, then closer, though I knew it couldn't be anyone. Not the waitress, not the man at the window, not anyone I'd met. It was just the beginning. The drive was longer than it should have been. I remember thinking that as I left the town behind, the streets that had felt familiar just an hour ago now seemed narrower, tighter, and oddly crooked. The streetlights blinked sporadically, casting pools of yellow that didn't quite reach the edges of the road. My headlights cut through the dark, but the trees at the roadside seemed to lean closer with each passing mile, bending toward the car like they were curious or hungry. There was no traffic, not a single other car, not a single pedestrian, nothing but the dull hum of my engine and the occasional scrape of a branch against the fender. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't driving alone. Something was there, watching, waiting. It didn't need to make noise. It just existed in the space beside me, in the corners of my vision, in the shadows that moved a second slower than they should have. The road twisted, curved back on itself in ways that didn't make sense. I knew the general direction north, away from town, but the sign seemed wrong. Familiar landmarks appeared, then disappeared, as if the terrain was shifting while I wasn't looking directly at it. I blinked. A mile marker I had passed moments before was suddenly ahead again. The edges of the road blurred, like ink dissolving into water. I tried to focus on the hum of the engine, the tires against the asphalt, anything to ground myself. But the hum from a line earlier that day seemed to come back, this time under my feet, in the seat beneath me, inside the car itself. Low, vibrating, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something ancient and patient, thrumming just below perception. I noticed it first as a flicker in the rearview mirror. Not a car, not a person. Something moving with a shape that couldn't belong to anything human. I caught it out of the corner of my eye and glanced again. Nothing. Just the road. Just the trees. Just darkness. And yet, I couldn't forget the shape. Even now, thinking back, it wasn't a creature. Not exactly. It was more like a distortion of expectation. Something that shouldn't exist in the way it existed. And it was waiting. I passed a bridge over a creek. The water shimmered, strangely reflective, though it was night. In the reflection, I thought I saw, not my car, not my headlights, but something moving behind me, long and thin, stretching across the water, like black ribbons reaching out toward the bank. I blinked. The ribbons vanished. Only the quiet, black water remained. The radio had long since died, static or silence replacing any signal. Even the soft hiss of the tires seemed muffled, like the road itself was swallowing sound. And then I saw it. A building, half hidden in the dark. The shape was impossible at first. Not like a house. Not like any structure I'd ever seen. Long, low, and sprawling, with angles that didn't align. Straight edges that curved in impossible ways. I slowed instinctively, as though the car understood something my mind hadn't yet. The headlights revealed a door at the center, a simple, ordinary door. Yet the way it sat there, framed by impossible angles, made me uneasy. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't open, but it was waiting. I parked a safe distance away. My hand shook, though I couldn't tell if it was fear, anticipation, or the realization that I'd gone too far. And as I stepped out of the car, the night seemed to fold in on itself. Every shadow lengthened, every sound dampened. The air was thick, not heavy, but dense, like trying to move through water. The building itself seemed to breathe, slowly, unknowably. I didn't hear it, not really, but I felt it. The presence of something beyond comprehension pressing from inside and outside at once. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back down the road to the lights of town, but my legs wouldn't obey fully. My body had already been cataloged, marked in some way I didn't understand. Something had taken note, and it didn't want me to turn away. I took another step. The door seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, in the corner of my vision. Straight edges bending where they shouldn't. Shadows crawling across surfaces that should have been smooth. And I realized fully that once I crossed that threshold, nothing would be the same. It wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a job. It was something older, something patient, something that remembered long before I existed, and that was beginning to remember me. I hesitated for a moment longer, felt my heartbeat in my throat, and then I reached for the door. The door creaked when I pushed it open, a sound far louder than it should have been in the still night. Inside, the air was cooler, heavier, as if the darkness itself had weight. It smelled faintly of wood and something older, something faintly metallic, like iron mixed with dust that had been collecting for centuries. At first, the room seemed simple. Just a square space, sparse, with a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were blank, smooth, featureless, except they weren't. Not exactly. When I moved, subtle shadows shifted at impossible angles. Corners didn't meet like they should. Edges bent slightly, just enough to unsettle the eye. The light seemed to stretch differently in different spots, elongating, folding, creating pockets of darkness that shouldn't exist. And then I saw the rules. They were written neatly on a sheet of yellowed paper, taped to the wall near the far corner. Simple instructions, typed out with care, as if someone had known I would need guidance. The words were plain, almost casual, but they carried a weight I couldn't understand at the time. Sit where directed. Do not speak unless spoken to. Observe quietly. Do not leave until dismissed. Never acknowledge what you hear outside the room. I read them twice, slowly. The simplicity of the instructions was comforting on the surface, but the more I stared, the more I realized the rules were not just instructions. They were warnings, embedded warnings, and not about danger I could see, but danger I could feel. Something in the walls and the floor, in the way the shadows lingered and stretched. It was watching, and it would respond to the smallest deviation. I found the chair that had been pointed out in the instructions. It was ordinary, wooden, worn, but the moment I sat, the world outside the door seemed to bend slightly. My body felt heavier, like gravity had a new, more deliberate pull. The shadows in the corners deepened. The hum I had heard in the car was here too, low and omnipresent, vibrating through the floor, through the chair, through me. Time started to feel wrong. Seconds stretched, then compressed, then stretched again. The light bulb above me flickered, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer, in a rhythm I couldn't track. Every so often, I thought I heard faint murmurs, not human words, but echoes of language my mind almost recognized, like a half-remembered dream. I reminded myself I was alone. I was alone, and yet something was present. The walls seemed to lean closer when I shifted my gaze, as if urging me to look at something I wasn't ready to see. I glanced at the paper with the rules again. They were unchanged. No new instructions. Nothing to explain the tension coiling in the air. And then I realized the rules themselves were part of it. Not to guide, not to protect, but to condition. To teach me what could be tolerated and what could not. I didn't move for hours, though time had no meaning anymore. I just sat, observed, listened. The hum continued, deepening, threading through my consciousness. Shadows crawled along the edges of the room, stretching into shapes I couldn't identify. Shapes I didn't want to. Shapes that seemed to mirror my own unease back at me. And then I noticed the first sound. It was subtle at first, like a breath too slow to be noticed. A sigh that wasn't my own. It came from the direction of the wall opposite the door. Soft and careful, almost polite. I didn't flinch. I didn't want to. I reminded myself of the rules. I observed quietly. I waited. The sound repeated, longer this time, and I thought I could hear a pattern in it. Not words. Not exactly. But some form of communication that my brain tried and failed to interpret. Every time I focused, it shifted, teasing me, vanishing when I thought I understood. I started to understand then that being a night watcher wasn't about guarding something physical. It was about bearing witness, about enduring the presence of something older, patient, aware, and unseen. And every second I obeyed the rules, the presence seemed to settle. Every second I wavered, it stirred. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed like that. Shadows moved, walls breathed, hums pulsed through the air. And I realized the hum was not just sound. It was attention. It was awareness. It was waiting for me to notice it, to respond, to falter. And I did. A small twitch of impatience, a blink too long, and the shadows reacted. Something shifted in the corner. Something darker than darkness, more deliberate than shadow. I didn't see it clearly. I couldn't, but I felt it stretch toward me, waiting to measure what it had found. That night, I learned that the rules weren't suggestions. They were the only thing keeping me intact, keeping me sane, keeping me here long enough to survive the first night. And I would need every rule, every pause, every breath, to survive the next. I don't know how long I had been sitting when I first heard it. It started as a whisper, not a human whisper, not a voice formed by lips or throat, but a sound that threaded itself through the hum in the floor, through the chair, through the air itself. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls, the corners, the shadows, they carried it. I tried to stay still, reminding myself of the rules. Observe quietly. Do not speak unless spoken to. Sit where directed. But the whisper continued. At first, I thought I imagined it. My mind exhausted, grasping for some familiar signal, some anchor in logic. I told myself it was the hum of the building, the natural resonance of old wood, the wind threading through the walls. And then the words formed. Not words I could recognize at first. Something older than language. Something not meant for the human ear. I understood them anyway. Not consciously, but in a way that bypassed thought entirely. A meaning that lodged itself in the corners of my mind, gnawing at me, watch. Stay. Obey. Notice. My pulse quickened. My breath hitched. I reminded myself rules. Observe quietly. Don't acknowledge the sound. But the whispers grew louder, threading into tones that almost mimicked language, calling my name, stretching it across the room with something patient, something deliberate, not angry, not cruel, not even hostile in the way I understand hostility, just aware. And I realized I was a subject under its gaze. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But the room, the building, the air itself resisted. My legs felt heavier. My arms heavier. The chair pressed down in ways it shouldn't. And I knew fully that this was not a trap that could be escaped by motion. The building wasn't a room. It was a prison shaped to test the mind. A labyrinth constructed not of walls, but of attention and perception. The whispers coalesced into something more structured. A pattern. Not a sentence, not yet, but rhythm that pulled my awareness toward the corners of the room I hadn't dared to examine. I looked, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. Shadows crawling along the edges of the walls. Not cast by light. Not responding to my presence, moving independently, shifting in shapes that were wrong, long, thin, impossibly stretched. Then they condensed into forms vaguely humanoid, but with limbs bent in ways that should have been impossible. They didn't move like people. They moved like gravity moved, like physics itself had paused to let them test the world. I shut my eyes. I try to ground myself, breathe slowly, observe quietly, but the voices didn't stop. They threaded through my eyelids, into my skull, a presence pressing from the corners, from behind the walls, from beneath the floor. And then, faintly, something in the far corner of the room began to take shape. Not solid, not fully formed, not yet, just a distortion. Like heat rising over asphalt, or the bending of air around a flame. But I knew it was listening, and in a way that defied reason. I knew it was measuring me, studying my reactions, waiting for a crack, a falter, a break in discipline. I tried to remind myself, this is why the rules exist. Observe quietly. Don't speak. Sit where directed. But I had already felt the first tendrils of curiosity, and curiosity is a dangerous thing here. I wanted to look closer, to understand what I was seeing, to name it, and I realized slowly that the building, the shadows, the voices, the hum, all of it was designed to make me want to do exactly that, and I didn't know if wanting it already meant I had failed. I stayed frozen in the chair, breathing shallow, heart hammering. The whispers were fading now, but not entirely gone. Just simmering beneath the hum. Waiting. Patient. As if I had only passed the first test, and the next had already begun. I couldn't sit there forever. I had to move. I had to understand. And when I finally dared to shift, my eyes were drawn to the far corner again. The shadows hadn't moved. Not exactly, but the distortion there had solidified into something more recognizable. A figure, or a half-figure, something humanoid, yet elongated, bending in ways no human could. Its presence carried weight, not of mass, but of intent, of knowing. And then I saw them. Not the thing in the corner, not the distortion, but people, real people, standing silently along the edges of the room. They were cloaked in simple dark robes, faces hidden beneath hoods. At first, I thought my eyes were failing me. The way they moved, the way they existed in the same space as the shadows. It shouldn't have been possible. They weren't affected by the bends in geometry, the distortions in light. They were anchored, solid, human, and yet not entirely. A chant began, soft at first, rising from the back of the room. It was low, guttural, and oddly melodic. The words were ancient, foreign, but I felt them in my chest, in my mind, like a vibration resonating across dimensions. The longer I listened, the more I realized the chant wasn't just sound. It was a signal, a summoning. I wanted to run, but the door wasn't where it should have been. I had entered through it, but now, in the presence of these people, it had shifted, warped, like the building itself was protecting them, or protecting something far older than them. One of the robed figures stepped forward, slowly, purposefully, and then, impossibly, the distortion in the far corner shifted toward them, not separate anymore. They moved together, synchronized, in a way that made my chest tighten. Not a human, not a shadow, but a combination of both. Something ancient and patient intertwined with flesh. The figure stopped at the center of the room, lifted a hand. The chant paused, and then, with a voice that was entirely human, but somehow echoed beyond comprehension, it said, "You are here because you were called, and you will witness." I understood, in a way that had nothing to do with thought. I was never meant to leave this room without seeing it, without understanding it, without knowing that there was a force, older than any human memory, being brought into the world. I realized then that the job, Night Watcher, was never about guarding a building or property. It was about bearing witness, about seeing without interfering, about surviving long enough to see the pattern of the summoning, to endure the presence, to remain sane when those around me would not. The chanting resumed. Shadows and shapes moved across the walls. Figures bent and twisted in impossible ways, and the human forms, robed, chanting, were guiding it, shaping it, calling it forth with knowledge that defied everything I had ever known. I wanted to speak, to run, to tear myself away, but the building, the presence, the hum, and the whispering all pressed in at once. My legs refused to move. My throat tightened. My mind struggled to resist comprehension that was never meant for human understanding. And then I understood. It was not only the robed figures I had to watch. The being they were calling wasn't just a creature, not just an entity. It was a truth, something older than the universe, patient beyond comprehension, waiting for human hands to loosen its cage. I swallowed hard, tried to ground myself, remember the rules, observe quietly, do not speak, do not leave until dismissed. But the room had shifted again. The shadows were closer, the whispers threading directly into my skull, and the chanting was no longer human, or maybe it never had been. It had become one with the hum, one with the building, one with the presence. I was terrified, but I stayed. I had no choice, because if I faltered now, if I even blinked too long, I knew the presence would notice, and what it noticed, it claimed. The moment came with a sound that froze my blood, a deep, resonant pulse from the walls, the floor, the shadows themselves. It wasn't a heartbeat, not exactly. It was something older, something patient, something that measured time differently from humans, slower yet infinitely longer. The chanting reached its apex, a wave of sound that pressed against my skull, testing my resolve. I couldn't stay still. I knew it. Every rule I had memorized, every second I had spent obeying, had prepared me for this. But there was no guide for what I had to do next. Only instinct, only fear, and the faint, flickering memory of the voice on the phone. One that told me I understood what I was signing up for. I wasn't alone. The new ally I had met, my friend, the mechanic whose car had broken down days before, was there, crouched behind a pillar, whispering, Listen, he said. I've been watching too. I've seen what they're doing. That thing out there. They can't bring it fully into our world. Not if we disrupt the pattern. I wanted to ask what pattern. Wanted to ask how we could possibly fight something that made walls bend, shadows crawl, and sanity itself fray. But the hum in the room pressed in, an invisible hand across my chest, reminding me that hesitation would be worse than death. Okay, I said. My voice was low, barely audible. What do we do? He pointed toward the altar at the center of the room. The robed figures had formed a circle. The cosmic presence, the distortion, the half-human, half-shadow, was coiling around the edges of the room, growing, pulsing, feeding off the chant. It wasn't fully there yet, but it was enough. We disrupted, break their focus. Chaos and pattern. That's all we need, he said. I nodded, though my mind screamed that this was insane. That we had no weapons, no guarantees. Only timing, distraction, and the courage to face something that defied reason. We moved together, quietly, deliberately, following the rhythm of the shadows, the pulse of the hum. Every step felt heavier, as if the building itself resisted our intrusion. The walls pulsed subtly, bending angles just enough to trip us, to push us toward failure. But we moved, slowly, carefully. I reached the altar first. The chanting was almost unbearable now, vibrating through bone and thought. My hand shook as I overturned the ceremonial objects. A small bowl of water, carved symbols, a bundle of twisted candles. Everything toppled. The chant faltered. The robed figures turned, confusion flickering across the impossible geometry of the room. Then the cosmic presence reacted. The shadows recoiled, pulling toward the distorted corner from which they had emerged. The hum grew, higher now, sharper, shrill in a way that made my teeth ache. Shapes twisted. The edges of the room seemed to fold in on themselves, and the air thickened with anticipation. But my friend didn't stop. He grabbed one of the fallen candles, smashed it against the floor. Light spilled, real, tangible, cutting into the shadows like a knife. The chant broke. The robed figures stumbled, murmuring incoherently as the presence hissed. Not in anger, not in pain, but in recognition. Recognition that it had been interrupted, that its pattern had been broken. The room seemed to shudder, not violently, not with destruction, but subtly, like the entire space exhaled. The shadows recoiled fully into the corners. The half-formed entity twisted, then vanished, leaving only a faint ripple in the air, like heat over asphalt. I sank to my knees, gasping for air, as if the presence itself had been holding my lungs in its grip. My friend came to my side, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with relief and terror. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." But I knew better. I knew the truth. This was not over. The presence had been pushed back, delayed, not destroyed. It had been patient for eons. It would be patient for more. And the humans, these robed figures, would regroup, try again, summon again. We had survived tonight. That was all. And as I looked at the shadows, at the bends in the walls, at the impossible angles that still clung to the room like a memory, I realized something else. We had glimpsed the truth. And once you glimpse a cosmic truth, you can never unsee it. The building was silent after that. Not just quiet, but empty in a way that pressed against my chest, hollowed the air, and made the shadows seem heavier than ever. The chanting had stopped. The robed figures had fled, retreating into the night like they belonged there, like the darkness itself had swallowed them. The cosmic presence was gone, dissolved back into some unfathomable void, at least for now. My friend and I stood there for a long time, neither speaking. The hum that had been constant, threading through the walls and floor, was only faint now. A reminder that the room, the building, the presence, still existed, waiting, patient, observing. I finally broke the silence. We survived. My voice was hoarse, shaky, but it's still there. Somewhere. He nodded. Yeah, it's patient. It's always been patient. And the others, they'll come back. The ritual isn't over. It just paused. I stepped toward the doorway. The angle of the room seemed to shift under my feet. The door itself looked smaller, taller, different. I realized the building wasn't fixed. It never had been. It was alive, in its own way, bending reality, testing those who dared enter. It remembered everyone who had ever walked its floors, everyone who had witnessed its truths. Outside, the night was heavy, thick with mist. The road stretched back toward town, but I didn't trust it. I didn't trust anything that felt normal anymore. Every shadow along the roadside seemed to twitch. Every tree seemed to lean closer than it should. The world itself felt wrong, warped slightly by the truths I had glimpsed inside. My friend and I drove back to town in silence. The car felt different, smaller somehow, pressed in by unseen forces. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see what might be following. But I knew, without looking, that the presence had marked me. I had seen too much, understood too much, and once you glimpse a cosmic truth, it never lets go. We parted ways near the diner. He said he'd lie low, keep watch, and that we would talk again. I didn't question it. Words seemed pointless now. Only survival mattered. I walked back to my apartment. The streets quiet, familiar, but never the same. Every corner I turned, every streetlight that flickered, seemed to whisper a warning. The town, the diner, even the bulletin board, it all felt complicit, as if the ordinary life around me had been a mask for something far older, far more patient. That night, sleep came in fits, shallow and haunted by whispers. I dreamed of the building, of shadows, of bending angles, of a presence waiting just beyond comprehension. I dreamed of the robed figures, chanting endlessly, calling to something far older than time itself. And when I woke, I knew two things. First, I had survived, and second, I had not truly left. The cosmic presence waits. The shadows watch. The whispers continue in the corners of the world. And I, an ordinary mechanic in a small town, have been marked. A witness, a survivor, and someone who cannot unsee what lies beyond the thin veil of our reality. The town seems normal now, almost harmless, but I know better, and I know that the day will come again, when patience ends and the summoning begins anew. And when it does, I will be ready, or I will be consumed. Until then, I watch, I wait, and I remember that some truths are older than memory, and far, far more patient than we will ever be.